They were Hitler's most effective and most feared weapons. Submarines that attacked in coordinated groups like wolves.
We had to learn strategy, how to attack, how to defend yourself against attacks, and how to wiggle out of a tricky situation.
In the Second World War, these stealthy predators sank thousands of Allied merchant ships, choking Britain in an economic stranglehold and devastating US coastal shipping from New York Harbor to the Gulf of Mexico.
All of a sudden, this tremendous explosion and a sheet of fire just shot skyward.
How the U-boat wolf packs almost won the Second World War. In the quiet seaport of Wilhelmshaven, Germany, submarine sailors in the modern German Navy train for combat exercises. By today's standards, the boats these sailors dip beneath the icy waters of the North Sea are quite small, and their air-dependent motors restrict the amount of time they can remain submerged. But despite their limitations, these tiny craft help defend the German coasts and carry out other vital missions.
Die U-Boote sind zum größten Teil für Aufklärung.
The submarines are mostly involved in reconnaissance exercises and participation in international maneuvers. They are also engaged in training with other NATO partners, how to use submarines against other submarines.
In such training maneuvers, some German boats play the role of the enemy. They are mock targets for much larger British and American nuclear-powered attack submarines. They work well in this role because they are similar in design to submarines deployed by enemies of NATO, such as Iran and North Korea. But while combating German submersibles is now merely a useful training exercise, in the past century, for the British and the Americans, it was a very real and very deadly challenge. In July 1935, German Navy Captain Karl Dönitz received word that he had been chosen to rebuild the German U-boat fleet. He harbored mixed feelings about the assignment. Years earlier, Dönitz had commanded a U-boat in the First World War. Then, the mission for him and his fellow submarine captains had been to wage war on British commercial shipping and cripple her economy.
The British worried mightily that the Germans would succeed in blockading their island and preventing the introduction of food, gasoline, raw materials, war material to keep them in the battle.
While Dönitz and his comrades enjoyed initial success, the British eventually defended their merchant ships by forming them into convoys, protected by fast maneuvering destroyers. This tactic defeated the U-boats. Captain Dönitz lost his own submarine to a destroyer attack and spent 8 months in a British POW camp. But in 1935, Dönitz skippered a cruiser, a surface vessel. With the High Command's emphasis on the surface navy, the ambitious officer had no desire for a backwater assignment commanding a new U-boat service.
The notion still in the back of the heads of many of the leaders was that Germany could not do without at least a sizable surface fleet. The commander-in-chief at the time was Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, and he did not, in contrast to Dönitz, have a U-boat background. So it should not surprise that his emphasis would be on the surface navy.
But Dönitz's enthusiasm for his task grew with his realization that submarines would play a much larger role in any impending struggle than most naval commanders recognized. Dönitz believed that Britain would inevitably join any future European war. He knew the only chance to defeat the powerful Royal Navy lay in the skillful deployment of Germany's most potentially lethal weapon, the U-boats. Dönitz therefore plunged himself into the job of constructing an effective U-boat force.
Wir haben ihn eigentlich als den Vater der U-Bootsfahrer betrachtet.
We regarded him as a father. He was humane and he had a lot of understanding.
Verständnis gehabt.
He developed a radical new approach to the deployment of submarines, the rudiments of the idea having first occurred to him 20 years before, as he languished in a British POW camp. For Dönitz, the primary reason U-boats were no match for British convoys in the last war was that each boat had hunted by itself and attacked at random. Once a U-boat fired on a convoy, it gave away its position, and destroyers immediately counterattacked. In this scenario, a submarine might destroy a single ship, but it then had to scurry away to avoid being destroyed itself. Dönitz realized a better approach would be to organize U-boats into attack groups, directed from a central headquarters.
The one thing that made that possible for him was radio. That he could, from his headquarters ashore, have his boats on a long string, so that the major decisions were made at U-boat headquarters and not out at sea.
Dönitz planned to space his U-boats 15 to 20 miles apart and deploy them in the potential path of a convoy.
And sooner or later, one of his boats, sometimes not, but sooner or later, chances were that one of his boats would pick up the convoy. And this boat then would become the one that would stay with the convoy, radio often direction-finding signals as a beacon, basically, and guide the other boats to the convoy.
When war broke, Dönitz planned to gather his U-boats into groups that would only surface at night to strike. The attack groups quickly assumed the ominous name of wolf packs.
The virtue of the wolf pack was that by having a large number of U-boats attack a convoy simultaneously, you would throw the escort vessels into confusion. Those vessels would be destroyers, frigates, corvettes, whose duty it was to protect the freighters and tankers forming the convoy. When the escorts were confused, it was thought that these U-boats could move in, make very rapid launches of torpedoes, move back out to the perimeter of the attack area, and return again in similar fashion.
But in order for this new tactic to work, Dönitz needed large numbers of submarines at his disposal, as many as 300 to completely devastate British shipping.
The Germans estimated that if they could sink 700,000 tons of British and Allied shipping a month, that would exceed the ability of the Allies to replace those losses with new construction. And that would, in time, strangle and starve Great Britain into submission.
Building 300 submarines would take several years. This didn't appear to be a problem, however, since no one in the German Admiralty expected a full-scale war before 1942. But when, on September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, Britain and France declared war 2 days later. Without adequate numbers of U-boats to form wolf packs, Dönitz had no choice but to send his few submarines out on patrol as lone wolves. These hunters would target both merchantmen and warships. One lone wolf, U-47, skippered by Lieutenant Commander Gunther Prien, embarrassed the Royal Navy with one of the most spectacular exploits of the war. On the night of October the 13th, 1939, Prien crept into Scapa Flow, the British fleet's primary harbour in the Orkney Islands, north of Scotland. 2 well-placed torpedoes sent the battleship Royal Oak along with 800 British sailors to the bottom of the harbour. Prien slipped away unscathed and undetected. He became an instant hero in Germany.
In fact, they flew him to Berlin. There was a parade in Berlin. He was the man of the hour. They were all decorated. The newsreel people were there, and the Germans had their first real U-boat ace of the Second World War.
The success prompted Hitler to step up U-boat production. Karl Dönitz, now an admiral, would soon have enough boats to execute his master plan. Full-scale wolf-pack attacks were about to begin. After the success of Lieutenant Commander Preen's lone wolf attack on the Royal Oak, the role of a submariner became romanticized in the eyes of the German public. Young men strove for acceptance into the elite and now glamorous U-boat service. Gerd Kelbling entered the U-boat service aged 26. As skipper of U-593, he commanded a crew of over 40 men on 16 active patrols.
Dass die größte Herausforderung ist, die einem jungen Seeoffizier gestellt werden kann.
I believed it was the greatest challenge a young officer at sea could have. His own boat and the chance to fight in the Atlantic Ocean or in the Mediterranean and to help win this war. This was our vision, of course, in the beginning of the war.
Pete Peterson hailed from a seafaring community in northern Germany near the border with Denmark. He served for 3 years aboard U-518.
I knew that I did not care to go to Russia in a foxhole at 30 below zero with nothing to eat and getting shot at. That I did not want to do, and that's where most likely I would have wound up if I had joined the infantry or the army.
Most U-boat volunteers were young men between the ages of 18 and 30, eager for adventure at sea, eager for a chance to prove themselves and return to the hero's welcome that awaited nearly every U-boat returning from patrol. But desire was not reason enough to be qualified to serve on a U-boat. Successful applicants usually brought a needed skill to the job.
They generally came from backgrounds that were very technically oriented, and they had already some experience with machinery work or metalworking or plumbing or pipe fitting or something like that. And these were skills that were highly valued in the Navy in particular, but especially in the submarine. You'd be out at sea for 3-4 months at a time, and you had to be somewhat self-sufficient.
Throughout the war, the Germans relied on 2 primary U-boat designs, the Type 7 and the Type 9.
The Type 7 was a smaller boat of roughly 500 tons. It was sort of the sports car of submarines. It was an easier boat to control. It could get underwater quicker. It was used more often in the convoy battles in the Atlantic. Whereas the Type 9 was a larger boat. It was rated at about 750 tons. It was sort of the Boeing 747 of the submarines. It was just slower in its reaction time. It was heavier. And so it was primarily sent off to patrol in open waters on its own as a lone wolf out of the sea.
Living conditions on either boat were anything but comfortable. At sea, an average of 50 men, usually 4 officers and over 40 crewmen, lived together for weeks at a time in a smelly, cramped space filled with pipes, cables, valve wheels, and other hazardous obstacles.
The interior of the U-boat was jammed with food, cans of food stacked in every corner, bread and other food supplies hanging overhead in hammocks, and torpedoes in the forward and stern torpedo rooms, taking up an enormous amount of space, preventing, for example, the bunks from being drawn down from the sides.
Technically, there were separate living spaces, or messes, for officers, petty officers, and seamen, but limited space prevented any real privacy.
And yet there was a lot of camaraderie. You couldn't help it. If you had to go from here to the control room, you had to go through all these different messes. And you saw these people. Maybe they were standing there in their underwear and the officers were shaving or whatever they did or washing up, and you had to go through there. So there was a tremendous camaraderie.
Much of this camaraderie grew out of mutual dependence on one another.
They depended on me with their lives to do the right thing, do it properly, do it in time, and I depended with my life on my buddies doing their job well, doing it right, doing as they were told.
A small mistake or lapse of judgment on the part of anyone on the boat could sacrifice the lives of the entire crew.
As an example, how we relied on each other and depended on each other. At one time, we were cruising underwater. And when you cruise underwater, everything is relatively quiet. There's a little humming of machinery, and there are some people talking, and so on and so on. I was on duty in the control room. That was my workstation in the control room. And above the control room is the tower, where the helmsman sits and steers the ship. And he was sitting there all by himself, and he had a watch of about 4 hours.
Out of boredom, the helmsman reached for a flare pistol mounted next to his seat. Toying with it, he accidentally fired both barrels down to the control room.
And there were these little red, blue, and yellow balls dancing around in the control room, and we were chasing them with fire extinguishers trying to get them out. Now, if one of those little balls had gone next through the next bulkhead into the battery, it could have blown up the ship. And nobody, but nobody would ever know what happened to us. I can't help but wondering sometimes how many went down by accident just like that.
While such minor accidents were frequent throughout the war, the event that proved most damaging to the overall U-boat force occurred relatively early in the struggle. On May the 9th, 1941, the British escort HMS Bulldog attacked and disabled Lieutenant Commander Lemp's U-110. Confident that the British destroyer was intent on ramming and sinking his submarine, Lemp ordered his crew to abandon ship. He made no attempt to destroy any of the secret materials left aboard, as he was sure the sub would sink. Georg Hogel was the submarine's radio man.
We kept yelling to the commander up in the tower because we wanted to find out what was supposed to happen with the secret matter, whether we were supposed to bring it out or not. But he just kept yelling, "Leave everything inside, get out, get out. Leave everything as it is," for he saw the destroyer dashing toward us, intent on cutting us in half.
Seeing the German sailors already in the water, the Bulldog stopped short of ramming the submarine. While taking the U-boat crew prisoner, the British scrambled aboard U-110 to seize its contents. Among the items taken was a top-secret Enigma machine and its codebooks. The Enigma machine was used to encrypt all message traffic between U-boats and their headquarters in Paris.
These materials were rushed back to Great Britain to Bletchley Park, northwest of London, where British cryptographers immediately made use of them in solving naval enigma, which was the naval cipher, in which all messages were transmitted. And all of a sudden, the British were looking over the shoulders of every radio operator in the German U-boat fleet, reading every message. It was a tremendous breakthrough.
Back in France, Admiral Dönitz assumed U-110 was simply lost. He never learned of the security breach. It would later prove to be a crippling setback for the Germans. In the short term, the U-boat war expanded to a new battleground, the waters off the east coast of the United States. From the outset of Britain's mounting struggle against U-boat attacks, Winston Churchill had pleaded with President Roosevelt to provide warships to help escort British convoys across the Atlantic. By early 1941, Roosevelt relented, and U.S. destroyers joined the effort. Initially, German Admiral Karl Dönitz urged his U-boat captains to avoid sinking American ships. Hitler had no desire to provoke yet another powerful enemy. But in December 1941, when Hitler declared war on the U.S. out of solidarity with his Japanese ally, American ships became fair game. Wolf packs would now have free rein to roam the seas, attacking anything that moved. Dönitz immediately ordered 3 of his long-range submarines to the east coast of the United States to wage war on U.S. merchant shipping.
These U-boats were told to attack on a certain day that would be transmitted to them while they were at sea. And the aim of the attack was a sudden explosive charge against Allied shipping that would humiliate the American people and frighten them. All of the boats were to attack at the same time on the same day, and so Dönitz gave the name Paukenschlag, German for beat on a kettle drum, to the operation. Paukenschlag would be translated in English as drumbeat.
Reading the broken Enigma transmissions, the British were able to warn the US Naval High Command that German U-boats were in transit, heading for the Atlantic coast. However, few authorities in the US believed that the small German U-boats had the capacity to transit the Atlantic Ocean, patrol, and then return to their ports in occupied France. US harbors were left virtually undefended. In late January 1942, the first 3 German U-boats arrived at the American coast unopposed. U-123, commanded by Lieutenant Hardigan, arrived at the mouth of New York Harbor and then turned south.
As they steamed south along the Jersey shore, his second-in-command, Horst von Schroeter, told me I could smell the trees and the bushes along the Jersey shore. And we marveled at the lights of the resorts and amusement parks. Back in Germany and all along the British coast, all the lights were blackened out. Everybody practiced total elimination of lighting. But here along the American shore, it was as though the Americans didn't know a war was on.
While the lights helped nighttime coastal shipping navigate, they also silhouetted each ship perfectly. This made them ideal targets for a submarine captain aiming a torpedo. Oil and dead bodies began washing up on shore, from New York to Cape Hatteras. Within a 3-month period, the U-boats sank so many ships along the coast, the US Navy thought an entire fleet of submarines had arrived. The Germans would hide on the bottom of the ocean during the day and then rise to the surface to attack at night. On the evening of April 10th, 1942, Captain Hardigan in U-123 surfaced and made his way within sight of Jacksonville Beach, Florida. Crowds of weekend fungoers jammed the beachfront and pier.
They were sailors from the Naval Air Station at Jacksonville. They were soldiers from nearby Camp Blanding. They were civilians, all taking part in the activities provided by a large amusement park, where you had merry-go-rounds and other rides. You had all kinds of restaurants and bars.
At approximately 10 p.m., Hardigan spotted the SS Gulf America, a fuel tanker on her maiden voyage up the coast from Port Arthur, Texas. His U-boat prepared to attack.
When the people heard the explosion and saw the fire offshore, they poured down onto the beach to watch what was happening.
William Gufford was just 13 as he sat on a bench next to the pier.
All of a sudden, this tremendous explosion and a sheet of fire just shot skyward. And the explosion was great enough to where it vibrated the seat that I was on. And I'm told it could be felt as far away as Mayport, where it rattled cups and saucers on the shelf. And I had no idea what happened. I knew that an explosion had occurred, but I didn't connect it with a torpedo or a submarine at the time. That became evident in a short while because I could hear reports going off, like cannon shot.
Philip May was 17 and on a double date at the amusement park.
The 4 of us at that point had ridden on several rides, and we were on the merry-go-round. And I can picture it so clearly as I came around from the land side facing the ocean. I saw this enormous orange ball of flame out in the water. And Well, my first reaction was, oh my gosh, there's been a terrible marine accident. Went on around, and that flame died down, but you could still see some sort of smaller flame out there, and we just didn't have any real concept as to what it was.
Because fuel tankers were so compartmentalized, they did not always go down with one torpedo hit. So Captain Hardigan planned to use his deck gun to sink the ship.
But Hardigan looked over the hulk of this tanker and saw all of the people on the beach, all the lights on, and people had cars. They had turned their cars around and were shining their headlights out to sea. And he realized that if he fired an errant shot, it would go right into that crowd of people and kill them. So he made the decision to take his U-boat around the blazing tanker. He went around to the other, that is the shoreward side of the vessel, and pointed his gun out to sea and began firing.
To the horror of the bystanders, the gun's muzzle flashes revealed the outline of the submarine. There was no longer any doubt as to the source of the initial explosion. The burning wreck drifted for several miles along the coast before it finally sank.
On taking the dead bodies to Jacksonville from Mayport.
For the rest of the war, the city of Jacksonville Beach took measures to black out its shoreline at night.
Hardigan, after he shelled the craft, went on down towards St. Augustine, right off the entrance to St. Augustine. He submerged and was depth charged by a patrol craft that literally sunk his vessel. He prepared to leave the vessel, but on the last run, the craft ran right over him and then disappeared up to the north. And he found that his ship wasn't in quite the condition that they thought. I mean, they were taking on quite a bit of water at the time. He was badly, I think he lost one propeller, one engine, one shaft, and proceeded back to Germany only on one propeller.
As 1942 progressed, German U-boats continued their attacks on Allied shipping. But the terrifying wolf packs were about to meet their match in the form of the Allied counterattack, the Hunter Killers. The drumbeat U-boat attacks wrought havoc on American shipping off the Atlantic coast and finally spurred coastal defenders into action. Beach communities adopted blackout measures and formed civilian patrols to help watch for enemy submarines. Aircraft, both planes and airships, continually patrolled coastal waters. The US Navy and Coast Guard began forming merchant ships into convoys defended by destroyers and patrol craft, which faced frequent torpedo attacks.
The first one that I encountered was on a convoy of high-test aviation tankers going to Newfoundland, where they were used for refueling aircraft up there. Well, that's a little frightening, because if something hits one of those things, everything goes. It's one big bomb. And we had a sub firing at us. In fact, it went right under our hull. We heard it, and we knew it because we had been trained in the Navy schools on these records of the actual torpedo going through the water. And you couldn't miss it, you know. It was pretty scary.
Harris Weinstock served aboard a patrol craft that encountered and attacked a U-boat off the mid-Atlantic coast. Weinstock's vessel depth-charged the submarine as it attempted to surface. As the patrol craft came around for a second depth-charge run, they saw a man make his way out of the conning tower and jump into the water. The second round of depth charges caused the U-boat to fold in half.
It was pretty ugly because there were pieces of people. I don't like, you know, it was very gory. Way over in the distance there was a man was swimming. So I mean, common sense. It must have been the man that had come out of the conning tower. So we threw him a line, he came aboard, and identified himself as being the commanding officer
of U-521. He was the only survivor. Defensive measures along the American coast gradually improved to the point that Admiral Dönitz ceased Operation Drumbeat and ordered his U-boats away from the U.S. shore. The Germans would now venture back to the middle of the Atlantic. But with the increasing advances in all aspects of anti-submarine warfare, the days of the wolf packs were numbered. Throughout the war, Admiral Dönitz had been careful to keep command of the U-boat force centralized.
He had the ability to think himself into our situation. Of course, U-boat warfare in World War II was completely different from the previous war, but he had a particular understanding because he was a U-boat commander himself.
But Dönitz's close involvement with his boats contributed both to their success and their defeat. While centralized command was effective in coordinating wolf packs, it required that the U-boats break radio silence to communicate with headquarters.
Which meant that every time a German submarine went on the air, and in order to communicate with Dönitz, they did that very, very often. Basically, they could be pinpointed by the use of triangulation, other techniques, by shore stations, and their location would be given away.
This was just one of several anti-submarine measures the Allies were employing by the late spring of 1943. From the start of the war, the British had used ASDIC sonar to locate submarines beneath the waves.
It was an instrument that sent out sound pulses. And if those pulses found a submerged object, such as a submarine, an echo would return. And a ping would identify the fact that there was a submerged object at this particular bearing and range. Not until late 1943 was it possible for the device to also tell you the depth of the object.
Now, in addition to ASDIC sonar, British and American ships and planes were also equipped with radar. This now allowed them to detect objects on the surface of the ocean. A radar forced U-boats to remain submerged for longer, depriving them of their ability to find the convoys. But the fatal blow to the U-boats came with the use of anti-submarine hunter-killer groups. These were groups of Allied destroyers that accompanied small aircraft carriers. When planes from a carrier spotted a submarine, destroyers would give chase. The warships would then pinpoint the submerged U-boats with ASDIC sonar and launch depth charges until the boat sank, even if it took several days. U-boat veteran Pete Peterson recalls one such episode that took place in the mid-Atlantic.
We were caught by 6 destroyers, and they nailed us for 36 hours with run after run after run, and dropped depth charges at us. We were sinking deeper and deeper. We took on water at that point, and the skipper said, "Get ready to abandon ship. You're going to blow it to the surface, and we go over the side." And we all stood there and got our life preservers on, put our life preservers on, and small little values, rings and wristwatches. We put them in condoms because they were watertight. We blew the ballast out and we popped to the surface. And nothing happened. And the 6 destroyers were lined up. The bridge could see them laying there. And the captain said, "Start an engine." So we started a diesel and took off. Still nothing happens. The captain said, "Start the other diesel." We started the other diesel and took off. And by that time, we had our rear toward the destroyers. And we picked up speed as fast as we could go and got away. How we got away that time, I have no idea. We will never know.
In the months and years to come, as hunter-killer groups refined their deadly tactics, fewer and fewer submarines would experience the good fortune of U-518. The luck of the once feared wolf packs was about to run out. By early 1944, Allied hunter-killer groups had honed their strategy and carried out anti-submarine counterattacks with deadly accuracy. That summer, a hunter-killer group based around the aircraft carrier USS Guadalcanal spotted U-505 off West Africa and gave chase.
And they made a hedgehog attack. And the hedgehog is a mortar. It's shot off the front of a surface ship and in groups of 20 or 30 at a time. And these go forward of the attacking ship and they hit the water in a circular pattern and they sink down. And if they contact something, one of them will explode or two of them explode, and then they set off all the other ones that are in that area.
The hedgehog attack did not find its mark, but follow-up depth charges put the U-boat out of commission.
They started going deep without any control of the boat. The rudder was jammed hard to the right. They had no steering control on the boat. And many of the gauges had been smashed, and there was a report of water coming in the rear. So the order was given to blow air in the tanks and come to the surface and abandon ship.
Ships in the hunter-killer group opened fire on the U-boat. Combat cameramen on the scene captured the event on film. When the submarine crew started abandoning ship, the hunter-killer group captain ordered the firing stopped and sent a boarding party to attempt to capture the U-boat before it sank.
After the firing stopped, it was merely about 8 minutes that was needed for the boarding party from the USS Pillsbury to get to the submarine. The submarine was operating on its electric motors. It was turning in a circle hard to the right.
Engine room operator Zenon Lukashus was one of the sailors in the boarding party.
We're passing the submariners in the water, and this one German says, "Save me, comrade." And I spoke back to him in English, "Don't worry about a thing." I said, "We got a couple other ships. They're going to pick all you guys up. You're not going to, nobody's going to drown. We're going to pick you all up."
Once inside, Lukashus headed for the engine room to try and shut down the electric motors.
When I get around the periscope, I could see the water coming in. See, now, we were not standing in water, because all the water, the way the ship was tilted, the water was all in the bilges, but it was all back aft. So all it needed, a little more water to tilt it some more, and then it would have slid down.
Lukashus stopped the water flow by replacing the cover on a pipe that had been opened by the Germans to deliberately scuttle the submarine. As evident here, in actual footage of the capture, the U-505 was nearly lost.
So the boarding party managed to gain control of the boat, and they started immediately gathering technical materials and documents and passing them topside. It was a huge haul of material that was captured from the U-505. Of course, they had a completely operating submarine, no Germans aboard, and here they are in complete control of this boat. They could gather everything they could possibly get their hands on, and it was eventually 9 mail bags that weighed 1,100 pounds of technical documents that were removed from U-505.
The Navy towed the German submarine to Bermuda, where it remained until after the war. With such setbacks as the capture of U-505 becoming more and more commonplace, Admiral Dönitz recognized that the glory days of his U-boat force were over. His wolf packs were no longer any match for Allied defensive measures. It was a lost cause. But Dönitz opted to keep sending crews out on patrol. If nothing else, his submarines could keep Allied warships and planes tied down. For every plane that flew over the Atlantic in search of submarines, he reasoned, it made for one less plane dropping bombs on German cities. The U-boat crews fought on, arguing it was the only way they could defend their families at home. This realization helped keep crew morale at a reasonable level to the very end. British, Russian, and American ground forces overran Germany in April of 1945. On April the 30th, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in Berlin. As his last official act, the Führer appointed Admiral Dönitz German head of state. Within a week of his appointment, Dönitz ordered his U-boat commanders to surface and surrender to the enemy. The admiral himself was taken into custody on May the 23rd and spent the next 10 years in the German Spandau prison. He died quietly in a suburb of Berlin on Christmas Eve, 1980. From 1939 to 1945, Admiral Dönitz lost some 784 U-boats. 26,000 of a total of 41,000 U-boat crewmen died, 2/3 of the total. It was the highest casualty rate of any military unit in the war. Today, the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago is the home to the captured German submarine U-505. It is one of a handful of U-boats that survived the war and serves as a tangible reminder of the epic struggle waged in the oceans of the world in the middle of the last century. Germany's modern U-boat service comprises some 14 vessels and just over 400 officers and men. While these submarine sailors of today respect the skill and dedication displayed by their Second World War predecessors, they wish to separate themselves from the ruthless aspects of the Wolfpack legacy.
Also da differieren wir schon immens. Es gibt gewisse Traditionen, die aufrechterhalten werden.
There are certain traditions that are being maintained, but we do not look back on the World War. The memories of that are quite negative, and for that reason, one doesn't like to compare with that time any longer.
To ensure their success, however, these U-boaters understand that one tradition handed down from the days of the Wolfpacks must always be preserved.
Man kann sich hier nicht aus dem Weg gehen. Man
You
weiß,
know
dass
that you
man
have to stick together
zusammenarbeiten muss, dass man
and that you have to work together
dass man ein Team
and that you are one team.
Jeder Mann in der
Each man in the
Besatzung
crew has his
einen
own
eigenen
specific place.
The Wolfpacks perfected an attack strategy never before seen in modern warfare. It combines stealth and military precision, operating deep beneath the dark waters of the Atlantic Ocean. In the 6 years of fighting, German U-boats sent more than 3,000, mainly British ships, to the bottom of the sea. They claimed the lives of over 80,000 Allied sailors and airmen.